Hello and welcome to The Real USA. Today we're at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. We thank you for your interest in the program and in these stories brought to you from the U.S. in a way that only Telesur could do. I'm Alexandra Hall. As you read these stories, I invite you to share your comments and suggestions via our Twitter at Telesur English. Over the past 6 years, 14 inmates in Texas jails have died from heat-related injuries. In some cells, temperatures can reach up to 149 degrees. That's comparable to the conditions that you might face in Death Valley. While some states have taken measures to control the climate of their correctional facilities, Texas has not. Nick Harper brings us this next report from Austin, Texas.
Prisons in Texas are the hottest anywhere in America. It's simply because they're not legally required to have air conditioning, which means it's not uncommon for jail cell temperatures to exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Former inmate Eugene Blackman experienced 2 weeks when the heat index hit above 130 degrees.
Ooh, man, it was like living in an urban. There's no ventilation. Water condition as to drinking water. There's no drinking fountains. You got to drink out the sinks.
In extreme heat, 14 inmates died. Their deaths led the University of Texas to investigate the overheating problem. They discovered evidence of the heat index at one prison topping 150.
The temperatures that are present in Texas prisons are very, very dangerous to the health of any human being.
Report author Ariel Delutsky was astounded that Texas, unlike other neighboring states, does not have standards or laws to control the temperature.
People are dying from something that it could be prevented. Why we don't have is because it is a forgotten population, because it doesn't appear that there is a political will from the authorities to adopt those regulations. It doesn't appear that there is an interest to protect the rights of these inmates.
The report found that 150,000 inmates in around 100 prison units are being forced to live without climate control. This is a typical cell for Texas's inmates. It's 9 feet long, 6 feet wide. Some of the older cells are even smaller than this. It's a small, cramped space for 2 people. And of course, there's no air conditioning. Prison guards also endure the same conditions. Union representative Lance Lowry says he's seen more than 150 officers leave in the last 2 years, many suffering heat stroke or heart conditions.
It feels like a convection oven when you're in the prisons. The sun hits these buildings all day long, heats the buildings up, traps the heat inside, and the ventilation is extremely poor. You have a state that has cut its budgets down so far that basic necessities are not being met.
Lowry says it's time for Texas to play catch-up with the rest of the world.
I would like to see the state of Texas step into the 21st century and add climate control to their prisons. You're not going to find any public facilities or buildings built in the last 30 years that are not equipped with air conditioning and climate control, with the exception of our prisons here in Texas.
Lawsuits have been filed against the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, but it maintains air conditioning is too expensive to add. For now, campaigners can only continue their fight against what they say is unconstitutional and try to force Texas to change its ways. Nick Harper for Telesur, Austin, Texas.
Let's keep going with prisons. While the United States represents about 5% of the world's population, it also houses around 25% of the world's prison population. A lot of those prisoners are held in jails in the state of Texas. Our next story is about the oldest Texas state prison in a small town called Huntsville.
Huntsville's main street is an unimposing place. It's Texas's version of quaint, small-town America. Yet a quarter of this city's population is made up of convicted criminals. Thankfully, they're behind bars, locked up on the other side of Huntsville's several kilometres of barbed wire fences. Jim Willett is no stranger to prisons. He worked at Huntsville's main unit for more than 30 years.
We've got 5 prisons inside these city limits that hold about 9,000 inmates. So in a town our size, that's a big chunk of the people.
Huntsville has the rather dubious claim to fame that there are more prisons here than in any other town in Texas. 9 in total, 5 within the city limits and another 4 outside, including the Holiday Unit that houses 2,100 inmates. But despite being surrounded by thousands of criminals, the people who live here have got used to it. Indeed, it's estimated 40% of the city works for the prison system. So for many, living and working among inmates has become second nature.
You know, when you come here for the first time, it probably, the way you feel right now, that it's just unbelievable that you have all these prisons here. But if you're raised here, or if you've come here and stayed for a while, you get real accustomed to it, real used to it. It's just a part of the city.
Brian McGivern is an attorney working to improve living conditions for prisoners at a time when mass incarceration is increasing dramatically.
Starting in 1970, the rate of incarceration around the country began to skyrocket, and Texas was no exception. Since 1970, our prison population has increased over 960%, even though our population has only doubled. The state went on essentially a building spree of prisons throughout the 80s and the 90s. Well, shockingly, during that building spree, they cut a few corners. And as a result, our prisons are essentially built like giant metal sheds, you know, with metal walls and very little insulation.
The state now has more people in jail per capita than anywhere in the world. A staggering 70,000 new people enter the prison system each year. And every 2 years, the state creates new jailable offences. Primarily, McGivern believes, to help politicians win elections.
Really, it devolves to a basic political dysfunction in the state where we love to put people in prison, but we don't actually want to spend anything for it. Our state legislature, it's very hungry to create new crimes because nobody ever lost an election because they were too tough on crime. But they have no appetite to pay for that system. I mean, it's a great unfunded mandate, and the people that ultimately suffer as a result are the people who are not being housed in constitutionally adequate conditions.
For private prisons run by for-profit companies, more criminals means more money. A disproportionate number of Hispanics are housed in private jails, and Congress could approve a request for $3.7 billion to lock up more illegal immigrants, money that will certainly make its way to private companies.
It's hard to put a thumb on what's too many. I mean, if there's that many criminals out there that the public thinks needs to be locked up, I can't say that it's too big. We have a huge state, after all, but it does, the bigger it gets, the harder it gets to handle.
Willett has retired and now runs the Texas Prison Museum, where the city's macabre past and present is on display. Just a few miles from here is the state's death chamber, where inmates are sent for execution. The electric chair used to be the tool of choice. Now, Texas delivers death with a lethal injection. During his 3 years in charge of Huntsville Prison, Willett oversaw 89 executions.
I don't have a problem with the death penalty. Now, I'm also one that you'll never see out protesting someplace in favor of it, but I don't have any problems with the death penalty.
Life in this prison city, so close to criminals and never far from execution, seems strangely surreal. But many of the residents, like Willett, have lived and built their life around serving this insatiable prison system. Nick Harper for Telesaur, Huntsville, Texas.
Every year, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, pays millions of dollars in pensions and injury compensations to men and women who have served in the U.S. military. But it also supports bills that require veterans to return some of that money that, according to the VA, was overpaid. Let's meet Tom McNerney. He's a veteran who received a letter in the mail from the VA informing him that he owes $37,000 that must be paid by the end of this year.
I was in the Air Force from 72 through 78. I served in SAC and in NORAD. A pension from
Tom McNerney has been receiving Department of Veterans Affairs, or VA, pension benefits since 2010, when he lost his job. But he recently received this letter saying the VA has been overpaying him and they want their money back.
Almost $37,000. It'll wipe me out.
Tom readily admits he made a mistake. He didn't know vets must declare all their sources of income to the VA each year. Declaring their income to the IRS, as Tom was doing, is not enough.
I filled out paperwork as honestly and honorably as I could, and the flow of paperwork claiming that I didn't give them complete or truthful information has been a little insulting and horribly confusing.
When he first received the overpayment notice in June, Tom said he was in shock. Eventually, he turned to these other veterans for advice.
The paperwork describing the overpayment and the demand for recovery of funds have all come fairly quickly, and I'm at a loss as to what to do because I don't know what's right and I can't follow it.
The Debt Management Center, located in St. Paul, Minnesota, denied our request for an on-camera interview and refused to answer our questions about how much these bills are generally for. They did tell us, however, that over the past 2 years, they've issued over 1.4 million overpayment notices. Lawyers specializing in Veterans Affairs explain that overpayment notices happen in a wide variety of situations.
It happened to me, and I'd gotten out of the Marine Corps in 1977 and had been paid a severance. Well, later on, when I got VA benefits, I had apparently not put on the document that I'd received this severance payment. Well, the VA says you can't receive both VA benefits and this military benefit for the period of time that the compensation was awarded. So they collected it back, and they can do that.
Agencies.
Attorney Sean Kendall said the overpayment problem is indicative of the bloated and inefficient bureaucracy across all branches of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
It's difficult because the taxpayers don't want to pay people benefits which they're not entitled to. But you would also expect as a taxpayer that the government would have a system so that people are not receiving benefits that they're not entitled to. And so in this case, if the VA system had been working, then this large overpayment would not have been created. I think part of the problem, though, is that the VA's culture and large bureaucracy is not adapted to really being touchy-feely with people. It really is a system that's designed to keep people at an arm's length. I mean, I think the policy of the Denver VA regional office and the Veterans Benefits Administration is to keep veterans at an arm's length, keep them out of their offices, and to not really provide information to them. So filing a claims for benefits or has been consciously made by the government as difficult as possible.
As for Tom, he says he wishes he'd known more about the benefit system sooner, before his bill got so big. Mary McCarthy for Telesur, Denver.
What happens to men and women after they serve in the U.S. Army? Mary McCarthy reports a story based on an investigation by the Colorado Spring Daily that finds that the number of soldiers discharged for minor violations is currently on the rise. Many discharged soldiers need health care now more than ever, but they can no longer access the benefits that they once had.
Cash Alvaro enlisted in the U.S. Army when he was just 18. He was deployed to Iraq, then to Afghanistan, where he suffered a traumatic brain injury.
I got hit really bad October 23rd, 2009. That was my big changing point in life. It was April when I had my first serious seizure. And me personally, I didn't even know what happened. I thought I just passed out. I thought, oh, maybe I was dehydrated. So I was in a room with a friend. My eyes rolled back, And he said from there you just convulsed, your eyes went back in the back of your head, you got tight, you were shaking.
The condition made it tough for Cash to fulfill his duties. But rather than providing medical treatment, the Army said he was guilty of misconduct and discharged him.
Just like having your family turn on you. So you put all your trust in your family, right? So you tell them something, you want them to believe you and be there 100%. So it's just like that in the Army.
Veterans advocate George Andrew Pagani says that he's seen many cases like Cash's at Fort Carson and at other military bases across the United States.
You are taking an individual who is very, very severely ill and requires not just short-term but potentially long-term medical care, and you're sending them out into the community without an ability to have access to proper and appropriate medical care.
Cash ended up homeless and accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills. Officials at Fort Carson Army Base declined our request for an interview, but they issued a statement saying they do not discharge soldiers to avoid providing needed medical care and benefits. Meanwhile, lawmakers here in Colorado are calling for a federal probe into whether the Army is unfairly discharging wounded soldiers. And this is an issue that's unlikely to go away anytime soon, given the huge number of soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or brain injuries.
Studies have shown that approximately 20% have experienced what we would call a probable traumatic brain injury. And so they've had experiences, they've suffered symptoms that would be indicative of having had a head injury while they were in theater. And we also find that about 18.5% suffer from either post-traumatic stress disorder or depression.
But Terry Tennelian says it would be premature to blame military commanders for targeting disabled veterans.
Understanding the nature of how these conditions affect those that are now going through the disability evaluation process, or who are going through medical discharge and separation, or who have been identified through other means is really undocumented and unknown. So I would say we really don't have very good answers about the extent of these problems, particularly among those who've been separated for other than honorable reasons.
Therapist Robert Alvarez, who specializes in treating veterans, says discharging soldiers who are dealing with brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder is unfair both to the individual and to the community.
When you release these people who aren't medically ready to return to society, then that burden becomes the community's. And often these individuals end up in the criminal justice system, they end up in the homeless system.
Cash is one of the lucky ones. He was eventually granted veterans' medical benefits. But for many other discharged soldiers, getting the care they need is still an uphill battle. I'm Mary McCarthy for Teleser in Denver.
Since the beginning of the Ebola outbreak, one New York company has seen its profits rise dramatically. Lakeland Industries makes hazmat suits, the kind used by healthcare workers in West Africa and also in hospitals here in the United States. While the company had a humble start about 30 years ago, their annual sales have now surpassed over $100 million, and many people are asking, is it ethical for a company to make money off of a global health crisis? Nick Harper has the story.
Stitching to save lives. In this sea of yellow are just some of the 25 million suits made every year in Lakeland Industries' 2 Chinese factories.
We are very proud that the protective suits we manufacture can be used by those who are fighting against Ebola. We feel that in this global campaign we are having our role to play.
Christopher Ryan is the company's CEO, based at their headquarters in Long Island, New York.
It can hold up under a fire hose, it will keep all liquids out, and bodily fluids is what transmits Ebola.
The company makes all types of protective suits, but it's their Ebola wear that has generated so much demand in recent months. Hundreds of thousands of suits have gone to West Africa, in particular to Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, the 3 worst Ebola-affected countries.
Oh, we're sold out to the Jew. We are in the position where everybody basically called us, and these are the major governments of the world, asking us to make, hundreds of thousands of suits. And so we're really booked out. We've almost tripled our capacity.
This startup company is now a multinational, pulling in $100 million in sales every year, which leads some to question the ethics of making money from this terrible virus. But Ryan says he has no qualms about the financial gains for his company.
Well, that's true of anything anybody makes. I mean, when you make garments for hospitals, they go into an operating room where they're saving lives. It doesn't bother me too much because in essence here, it's not the Africans paying for this. It's the U.S. government, it's the UK government, it's the Chinese government. It's the governments who I pay tons of taxes to, basically paying for this.
The suits themselves only take an hour to make, but are made to withstand the worst. Healthcare workers in Africa need to be certain fluids cannot pass through the suit, as that's the way the virus is transmitted. A healthcare worker wearing one of these suits would have extra coverings on their feet, on their hands, and of course on their face. But importantly, all of the seam lines are covered in tape. The reason being is that just the smallest pinprick can let through more than 12,000 Ebola viral particles. Demand globally has increased, with governments worldwide deciding that now is the time to get prepared.
What we really see after the Ebola epidemic is hospitals finally preparing. So they're finally waking up and saying, you know, we should have 10,000 of these in a closet somewhere. And they can sit there for 10 years and they'll be good. But they're a great insurance for us, and it might cost them $10,000. I mean, it's not a lot of money.
With the virus continuing to spread in West Africa, Ryan thinks there'll be no let-up in demand over the next 6 to 9 months. And depending on global efforts to contain the virus, his company is likely to see continued interest for some time to come. Nick Harper for Telesur, Long Island, New York.
Well, that's all for today's The Real USA. Don't forget to share your comments and suggestions via our Twitter at Telesur English. I'm Alexandra Hall. See you next time.